Good afternoon, everybody. Marty Richards with Richland Center Tourism here today. And today's version, it's a Wednesday, so it's why do we call it that Wednesday? And today's version is a little bit more of why did we do it that way version. But it's one of those things kind of mystified me when I was younger, and then when I figured it out, it's like, oh, that kind of makes sense. But you got to think on this one. It's when we have thoughts of why we do stuff or why we call stuff that. Remember, in this area, we were really settled by very practical and very utilitarian folks. Okay, so today's version of why do we call it that is really why are all of our barns red? So if you drive through the Wisconsin and really you get into the Greater Richland Center area, you notice there are a ton of barns. Now there aren't even as many now as there used to be, but there are quite a few of them. Back in the so like even in my younger years, in the 70s and the 80s, there were just tons of red barns dotting the landscape. Every now and then you'd run into a white one, or one that was not painted at all. But 70-80% of them were red. So how that started, that they became red, it actually goes back to the early settlers of this area. A lot of the settlers came from Europe, German, Irish, and English settlers to this area, and we've talked about that a little bit. And the barns even in Europe were red. So how and why were they red? Well, it was a pretty utilitarian purpose, as I mentioned. First off, what they would do is they would actually paint the barns with linseed oil. So we're talking turn of the century, in the early 1900s. They used to paint the barns with linseed oil. To give it a little bit of color and a little pizzazz, they would put a little bit of, ferrous oxide in it, or rust. They would actually put rust in with the linseed oil and put that on the barns. It would give it a little bit of color. Well, then as time progressed into the 30s, 40s, and into the 50s, they did start to paint them. Well, why did they stay with red? There were a lot of other colors in the rainbow by that point. Well, you guessed it. Yeah, they were a little cheap too. Red paint was the cheapest paint. So they continued that practice. Now, every now and then you'll see a white barn. And the question is, what's up with the white barns? Well, the white barns, did a little research on that, and there's really not any purpose behind it, except every now and then a neighbor kind of wanted to let the other neighbor know maybe they were doing a little bit better than they were in their farming operation. So to stand out, they'd paint with white paint, and that cost a little bit extra, so just a little bit of a status symbol. So if you ever wondered, like I did, why the heck are all the barns red? It was really very much just utilitarian. What was cheap? We needed to preserve the wood. Let's throw some ferrous oxide in there. And as time progressed, and not shocking for my ancestors, yeah, it was cheap. Red paint was cheaper, and so that just kind of continued that practice. So if you ever wondered and you're driving down the landscape why all the barns are red, or most of the barns, 70 to 80% of them, that's why. And the 70-80% figure actually comes from Robert's Barn Painting in Randolph, Wisconsin. Back in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, they used to paint 200 barns a year. That was their main business. Well, nowadays they say they paint anywhere from maybe 50 to 60 a year, because we do have fewer of them, and the gabled big red barn are starting to go by the wayside for smaller, lower construction buildings on our farmsteads. So that's why that is. I hope you enjoyed it. We look forward to seeing you when you come visit the area. Again, for Richland Center Tourism, I'm Marty Richards. Have a fantastic week.